in searching my memory of this society, and don't take that lightly, it was 43 years since I walked in that door. One thing stands out about this little church. For those 43 years, and I think for many years before that, we have been pretty much a hand-to-mouth organization financially. And as a result, we've always had a part-time minister. And part of the arrangement is that that minister is responsible for half the services during those months when he or she is on the job. So who's responsible for all those other Sundays? Because it's very important that every Sunday at 10 o'clock, used to be 11 o'clock, but at 10 o'clock, something is happening here. Some semblance of a sequence of activities, usually some music, a message, a Sunday service. And this is where the worship committee comes in. We are responsible for those other Sundays. You could look at this situation as a problem. We can't even afford a full-time minister. We're always scrambling to fill the pulpit. Poor us. I think it's actually good for us, an opportunity, and here's why. I grew up in Plymouth, and every Wednesday, school got out at 1 o'clock so people could go and do something at their church. This was in the Second World War. Well, the Catholics, they had something going every Wednesday afternoon. The Methodists didn't, so I got the afternoon off. But the Catholics went to church, and the answers to all the questions that they had were in the back of the book. So it was pretty easy for them to come up with a program. And when you went to church, you sat and listened to the priest. You were part of the audience. Well, as our Reverend Janet told us last week, being just an audience is not what Unitarians are about. We look to each other. We work together in searching for truth and meaning. We are active, not passive. This activity, taking responsible for Sunday services, which is what the worship committee does, is a creative activity. Sunday services, after all, are a form of theater. They have their roots in many, many years of people gathering, searching for truth and meaning. For those involved in putting on a service, the reward is growth. Just as a sculptor, a painter, a writer, or yet experience growth. We get to know each other, not just our superstars, the ones who have written books, like Ursula Goodenough, have their own choirs, like Jim Thomas, or put together organizations like the Y, like Judy Crawford. But every person who lights a chalice, lights a candle, reads a poem, shares a credo, carries around a handheld mic. Often, we look to the wider island community for our Sunday subjects. And almost always we find a voice who speaks clearly about our own principles. Journalists, indigenous people, environmentalists. We learn that we are not alone and that our values are shared and acted upon by others. To sum up, As we share the role of being more than just an audience, we become active participants. We get to know each other better. As we shoulder an ongoing artistic responsibility, we grow and we learn about the wider island community. Today we learn a little about our USMV Worship Committee and how it looks at its job. This group, which accepts and carries out the job of keeping our doors open every Sunday, what does it mean to them to do this work, the work of the USMV Worship Committee?
Thank you, Peter. I am Mary Jane Aldrich Moody, and after that great intro, I am going to launch into more specifics about the connection between UUSMV and me. I'm on the worship committee, and several components of my faith background inform my work. I want to say up front that I come from the Christian tradition of Bishop Tutu and Reverend William Sloane Coffin, also many less well-known priests and pastors. One very key piece of religion for me is ritual. I had lots of structure growing up. I had school till the middle of the day, then a big meal, then a nap. Church was a part of the weekly routine. Services could look quite different, depending on where we were living in the United States or South Africa, but always there was greeting, singing, and passing of the peace. One ritual that had a special significance for my brothers and me was the baptism of infants. My brothers and I mastered the words and actions, and we made sure that our dollies and stuffed animals were welcomed into community with Christian names. And this was how a black baby doll that arrived on Easter morning came to be christened Baby Jesus. Ritual more recently helped my family to cope with trauma and grief. We had children who came to us at ages 9 and 11 and knew scarcity, violence, chaos, and neglect. Regular meal times, early bedtimes, and quiet times all helped to provide certainty and security. Grace at the beginning of every meal allowed us an opportunity to bless our abundance of food and to hold the trials and tribulations of the day. The favorite grace was for food and flowers and happy hours and love that cares for me, for all the joys of girls and boys and dogs. We give our thanks to thee. Now that the children are launched, Chris and I still say grace every mealtime. It's not as scripted, but at the end, we always say, and be with the kids. My appreciation for ritual extends to the worship service, where I feel that ritual is a container. Part of putting together this service was really being more intentional about the different components and recognizing the routines that speak to each of us. Rituals and routines allow for playfulness and safety. They mark our coming together and our leaving. And very importantly, they recognize life's transitions. I bring my comfort with the daily practice of prayer to UUSMV, as you saw earlier today in the service. For me, it's an opportunity to quiet all the literal talk around the table and the chatter in my head. It's a time to listen to other voices, to value what is present, to hold the significant contributions of everyone who is present. Another key component of services worship service for me is that it's family-centered. Faith was something that my family practiced together. We went to church services and house church together. We baked bread together that was used for communion, and it was very special. It was white bread, not the brown bread of every day. There was a time it didn't bake fully in the middle, so we had to pull out the yeasty core bits. There wasn't time to rebake. And we just put it all together again and appreciated that this holy bread was holy before it was even blessed. We just thought that was great. Anyway, when the older of my two brothers decided he wanted to have First Communion, the priest came to the house and we discussed as a family the significance of communion. Ultimately, it was decided that even though my younger brother, who was only 4 at the time and much too young by most standards to have First Communion, but it was decided that we would take it together as a family. And this was logical because we had all our families together, all of our meals together as a family. When Sam and Samantha joined our family, we included them here in the life of UUSMV. We had a child dedication service, and their godparents, who are members here, have been really key, important figures in their growing up. Sam was so indoctrinated in UUism and its support of our family that he was shocked at age 19 to go to a service where 2 women living together were labeled an abomination. He proudly announced to us that he would never accept that his 2 lesbian moms live in sin. So family inclusion in services is something I value. Families face many daunting challenges. I believe they need extra support and welcoming. After all, once upon a time, we were all part of families with children, even though that might be long ago now. Lastly, I'd like to share that gardening for me is spiritual. And this is the last key component of worship for me. It's something that was introduced to me by another generation, firstly my great aunt, and then it was shared with grandfathers on both my mother's and my father's side. Putting my fingers in the mud stills my mind. Planting something in the ground is an act of faith, a magical yet. Collaboration between me and the earth is something I couldn't do on my own. By myself, I can create hardscape or a pond, but the softening of plantings happens because of something well beyond me, the miracle of growth. So here's a sneak preview. The first November service, we're going to do a worship service of bulb planting. And we'll get to enjoy gardening as spirituality. So stay tuned.
So I am the other 50% of worship services at this lovely church, this chapel, this congregation. My name is the Reverend Janet Newton, and I am a 3rd-generation Unitarian Universalist. And as somebody who inherited my faith, I have this very interesting conversation and set of connections with people. When I meet them and I ask them where they came from, it's quite actually rare to meet people who were raised in Unitarianism. I know that there are people in our congregation who have been, but it's one of those things where there are faith traditions that ask you to interrogate your faith before you accept it as your own. It's a sort of an expectation that you ask questions of it and make sure that it fits you before you come back into it. There are, among Unitarian Universalists, quite a few more people who identify as Unitarian Universalists than walk through doors. People who are raised Unitarian Universalists sometimes kind of stop going to church after a while, or they become ministers. I haven't quite figured out that paradox there. But people who identify that way, in part, it has to do with the invitation to own their own faith, their own journey, to have agency about it, and to recognize that they have an important role to play in their own personal faith journey, that it is not the church that is doing that for them. For me, when I first became a minister, well, a couple things. One thing was, when I first came here, I have a sort of interesting relationship with this congregation and this chapel. I was a student minister here, and I think it was my second or third week here that I got a phone call from Peter Palchis, who you heard from first, in which he told me how important it was that this church was lay-led, that it's 50% of its ministry came from its lay members and the community, and that it was such a huge part of what this church was important to this church and how the church saw itself. And I was new, and I was like, okay, yeah, sure. It made sense to me, although I'd never been in a church that had 50% ministry or less than full-time ministry. But I saw what happened when lay leaders got involved in churches and other places. One of the first things that I realized when I became a minister was this overwhelming sense of guilt that I was getting paid to do this amazing thing, which was to think about things that were really interesting and metabolize them and explore them and then get to talk about them on Sunday. You were actually paying me to have a spiritual practice that deepened my own life. And I didn't understand how that was fair. It felt like I was somehow being asked to do something that I wanted to do anyway. One of the things that they say about ministers is that we all sort of repeat the same sermon over and over again. But the other thing that I say is that everybody has a sermon in them. Everybody has something that animates their life, that is a part of how they have made meaning of their life and what they would share with a group of people if they had the opportunity to do that. And so I want to invite you to think about whether or not you are ready to explore what that sermon might be for you. Ralph Waldo Emerson said that a sermon was, or doing ministry in general, was life lived through the fire of thought. And I think that if you apply that to your own lives, if we think about each one of us living a life and thinking about it and making meaning and being a part of a search, supporting one another's search, being seekers, being travelers, having very different faith backgrounds that somehow still bring us into this space together, and then hearing with respect and joy when people have something to share with us. It's an extraordinary opportunity that you all have to fill this pulpit. So I want you to think about this as we go forward. It's not a gift that you have given to me to get to do this work. It's a gift that we all share, that we can all raise our hand and say, I think I have something that might be of worth to this community. And I hope that you will take part in an adult faith formation work this year where we explore what your sermon might be. It's a practice, a long-standing, or it goes over several weeks, but it's an opportunity for you to really think about what is it that you would say if you had a chance to stand up here and to put your spiritual beliefs into practice and give something to this community through the ways in which you think and act and be. I just want to close with these words that I always have on my computer when I'm writing, which are that my endeavor is to stay connected and to stay creative and to stay collaborative, to invite vulnerability and to reject cynicism. And I feel as though every single one of us could do that work, be connected and creative and collaborative and vulnerable and open to the possibilities of one another's voices.